Hi guys, this is Luetin, and today I'm joined by Daskro, and we're going to be discussing realism and authenticity in games in regards to weapons and also the general play and the layout of the games themselves. Now Daskro, first of all, you wanted to make a point about a differentiation between some terminology, so why don't you get us started with that?
Okay, well, again, my name is Daskro. I do both Battlefield videos and I do gun comparison videos. And because of this, now when I say gun comparison videos, I'm not talking about taking a given gun in the game and just playing around with it and speaking in a monologue. Instead, I'm taking the gun in real life, the gun with actual ammunition at an actual shooting range, and shooting that gun and then comparing it between it and the guns that we see in Battlefield 3. And it gives me a bit of a perspective on how authentic or how realistic these guns are to in-game. Now, realism and authenticity, in my mind, are two different things. For instance, when we look at Battlefield 3 at the recoil system, we have this sort of exaggerated bullet spread as we fire continuous rounds and a amount of recoil, both horizontal and vertical, that is utilized to differentiate each of the guns. In real life, recoil doesn't work nearly the same as that. However, when we talk about recoil in real life, which is when that bullet is expended and goes forward through that barrel, that gun has a tremendous kickback, and you can feel that kickback. It's not just something that you feel into your shoulder, but it's something that you feel with your ears because of this huge concussion blast, and you feel even with your face and your body, because that blast ripples through every aspect of yourself, and you can't simply recreate that in a video game. And so Battlefield and other video games of the first-person shooter nature try to maintain that authenticity of how the gun operates, of how the gun shoots, the firing rate, but they have to create their own mechanics to give the players the sensation of being able to shoot the gun and feel the recoil without actually having them actually feel it in real life. Likewise, when we hear the gunshots in the game, they sound very they sound vivid and they sound all-encompassing. And when we're in a given level inside, let's say, a building, we can hear the fire echo through the hallways. In real life, gunfire is so loud and so horrifying in terms of just the sheer force of it all that it's very hard to differentiate between one gun versus the other. There are some differences for those that do shoot quite often, but it's something that in the game you can't have a sound system that can do 100+ decibels and expect people to be able to experience that, or else they're going to blow their ears out and they're going to be liable for a bunch of damages, because we don't want that. But they do try to emulate some of the sounds that do take place and try to create this immersive experience to give you the feel authenticity. And so authenticity really is trying to get as close as we can while still creating an enjoyable experience, while realism is almost every aspect that we can think of. So, and it would be silly to think that if we were to play in a game such as this and then our character gets shot, that we too get shot in real life. That would be quite absurd. But when we talk about realism, it's something that we have to recognize that there are certain limitations in the games that we play, and in fact, instead of going for that full realism, it's that full authenticity, trying to utilize that creative expression to still create that experience.
And I think that that's something that's really worth considering, because often, very, very often, I see in topics and discussions from videos, people talking about realism in games. And often what they mean is they have a piece of equipment, be that on a vehicle or a gun itself, and they try to reference it to real life. And they say, oh, well, you couldn't do this, or you couldn't do that, or this piece of equipment wouldn't function or operate like that. And I say one of the examples was the ECM. I did my very large video about that, and there was a lot of discussion on that video about how these things worked in real life. But the basic crux of it was, it doesn't matter how it works in real life, because what they've done is they've taken a piece of equipment and then they've used it as the basis for something that they want to operate in game. And I think this is the thing, is that, you know, people need to start realizing that there's a line to be drawn between the reality and the fact that you're playing a game. And also, when you come to the layout and the overall gameplay of something like Battlefield, you could not operate that as it would be in real life and still have an enjoyable, fun game experience. It wouldn't work properly. And that's things that they have to consider when making a game. But that's a very difficult thing to do, because trying to draw the line between your game mechanics and actually how these pieces of equipment would function, they're trying to make them as realistic as they can be, like Daskros says, in terms of the sound, the way the guns handle, the way they operate. Not only that, but trying to get each piece of equipment to feel individual and to have its own characteristics, and then to take that and put it into a game environment that people can actually have fun, and it won't be just a frustrating, miserable experience where they're spending so much time trying to learn the equipment that it just becomes this slog and people can't actually get anywhere. I think that's an interesting one. But the thing is, usually when people are discussing pieces of equipment, when it's wrong. But I'll tell you something else that's quite interesting, that they put so much time into designing and trying out these things, but then you get certain pieces of equipment, as we know, that just have very, very high characteristics compared to others. I'd be interested to hear what you think, Daskro, about things like, for example, we've seen the USAS-12 in the past, the MAS, and the M16. Those are the three guns so far that I can think of that draw the most kind of criticism. What do you think of when it comes to guns like that, which seem to have these unusual characteristics? And does it just show that perhaps they don't really study these things as realistically as they could do, and they just kind of they take kind of almost the image and then go, right, now we're going to make it how we want?
I think it's the answer is the latter of what you described, which is the fact of the matter is that a vast majority of the guns in a given class in real life are not that much different from each other. We're talking about various nuances in ergonomics, various nuances in rate of fire, most of their operating systems in terms of whether they're gas impingement or short stroke or long stroke gas piston or delayed blowback. They're all very similar in nature. And if we're to make an assumption that in this game we are this highly skilled warfighter, this top tier operator who can make these mag changes within a second or two, that can vault over fences and foliage and what have you. To me, it's not unreasonable to think that if they're proficient in one gun and they've been as trained as it is, they could be proficient in a variety of guns. We look at the M4A1 versus M4 versus M16A3 versus A4 versus M416. They're all based on the old AR-15 ergonomics, and if you know one of those guns, you're going to know all those guns. And so the fact is that when you look at these guns in real life, they're going to be very similar to each other. So similar that you're not going to be able to easily tell a difference in terms of the kind of accuracy or recoil or bullet pattern differentiations that we typically see in Battlefield. In real life, when you compare two or three of these guns to each other, the difference is in inches at 100 yards. At 100 yards, if you can imagine the kind of engagements that we fight in Battlefield 3, it's at 25 to 75 yards, and it's not, the deviation is not in inches. We're talking about several feet deviations when we fire at people beyond 50 yards with the assault rifles, for instance, with the assault class rifles. And so the developers have to create some kind of differentiation between these multiple guns. Otherwise, it's just going to be, it'd be no different than having a different kind of skin in terms of like camo or rifle skin or gun camo or anything around those.
So they're quite an exaggeration, really, in terms of the weapons.
Well, they have to be, because if you made them all the same as per the specs beyond just the rate of fire, it would just be personal preference. It would be whatever they think the gun may look like. Now, there is some differences here and there between the bullpup versus non-bullpup designs, and there may be some differences between, for instance, the ACWR, also known as the Bushmaster ACR in real life, versus the other guns, only because it's in sort of a niche caliber. But beyond that, the real life differences in these weapons is very minuscule, and it's a whole lot more dependent on the operator, the person who's firing the gun itself, than it has anything to do with the gun. It's almost like basketball shoes. Logically,
then, it kind of makes sense as to why we see these kind of deviations between the weapons, why we see certain guns have these unusual characteristics that suddenly come to the front as like the way people say the god gun, because the fact that they've already exaggerated these characteristics means that then some are going to perform much more highly than the others because of the way they've kind of tracked and set up all the systems for each one, you know.
And because of this, there has to be sort of a differentiation. And while the guns are one side of the extreme, and then in real life there's not much difference. If we go to the other side of the extreme, where there actually is some huge differences, for instance, between the M1 Abrams and the T90 in real life, in that studies have shown that the T90, which in of itself is a T72 derivative, only can face the kind of armaments that the M1 Abrams has when it has Contact 5 explosive reactive armor. It doesn't have that. Its hull, despite the fact that it's very thick in nature, we're talking about several inches thickness of hardened reinforced steel here. Despite that, modern Sabo and modern heat shells are going to penetrate it. We saw this in legacy testing in the 1990s when the Army began acquiring T-72s en masse and testing how good their M1 Abrams shells were, and yet because of that huge difference in capability, and it's limited not just to the armor, but there's a number of other things in terms of the vehicle electronics that allow the Abrams to engage in much more precise fire relative to the T90. And this is not some kind of nationalism contest where just because I'm American I'm rooting for the M1 Abrams. Just, the fact of the matter is that the M1 Abrams has continued to get a lot of R&D funding, a lot of production funding for the last 15 years, whereas in Russia their budget hasn't been nearly significant. And but they in the game they're virtually identical in terms of capabilities. There's a few nuances here and there, and as a tanker I can describe them, but I'm not going to go into that. Instead, it's the fact that they have tried to make them pretty equal in terms of the amount of damage they do, the amount of damage they take, their speed, other things of that nature.
But when you think about the tank combat as well in Battlefield, it has to be in general one of the most unrealistic aspects of the game, I think, just because of the way you see people using the equipment, you know.
Yes.
I always try to keep my distance because the tanks themselves in game, they still have a lot of power. You can really do damage to buildings, people emplaced in things, and other vehicles if you can hit those targets from range. And it's one reason why I still really like the optics. I rarely see, for example, think about Caspian Border, first base. One of my tactics that I generally used to use, I don't do it so much now because I realise that nobody ever arms the MCOM anymore, so I tend to get in and get on with that. But I always used to really enjoy taking optics on the tank, sitting far away, and then raining down that sort of tank sniper fire onto the positions, and you don't see that so often in games, but I do remember actually in Bad Company 2 you would actually see it a bit more, which is kind of funny when you think of the almost more console driven style, but maybe with some of the larger, more open maps on PC there is more of that going on. I think with Tank Superiority, for example, there is more of that kind of long range tank engagement, and I think perhaps most of the standard maps are not necessarily designed for that. But I think as well that goes some way towards sort of identifying and showing the very fact that these games are not designed in a kind of realistic way for how they're designed to play out. They have to kind of cater to the way people want to play the game, which is they want fast, close action so that they can really get in the mix. And also think about it, if you had a tank constantly driving around far away just identifying targets and picking them off, people would never get a use for mines or C4. So there's all these other mechanics in the game that they've tried to draw in, and that's why they play out in this way. But let's also let's talk a little bit about Medal of Honor as well, because I know you had some key points about Medal of Honor that you wanted to make in terms of the realism there. Now Medal of Honor, they've tried to design it and they've tried to sell it as this realistic game. I know that they've done loads of referencing and research, and they've supposedly talked to lots of sort of tier 1 operators. I don't like the term tier 1, but it's I don't know what it is about it. I don't like it. But what do you think about that? And also from what you've seen of the game, do you think it stacks up? Do you think they can really make that claim? And from what we've talked about already about games, there's only a certain degree to which they can really claim to be realistic. I can't think of many games that I would classify as being, a realistic sort of representation of actual combat and stuff. And I tell you, from what I've seen of Medal of Honor, it doesn't seem to really to stack up in that ballpark. What do you think about that?
Well, I had made a few observations when looking at some of the beta footage for the Medal of Honor Warfighter game, and one of the things that really stuck out on me was there's this configuration capability for all your guns. You can change out the type of rail system, what kind of accessories you have, the magazines, the pistol grip, and even the buttstock. And I was surprised when I was watching this configuration video that they had a Magpul UBR, which for those that don't know is sort of an interesting AR-15 M16 stock that you can put on your gun. But to my surprise, they had completely botched the integration of it into the gun and game. It's almost as if they didn't understand how the Magpul UBR actually worked in real life, as in they never actually had handled one or seen one actually installed, and they put it in a way that clearly would not be physically possible in real life. It'd almost be like looking at a car and having a set of rims on the car, but instead of the rims being attached to the axle of the car, they were sticking out 15 inches away from the axle. That wouldn't make any sense. It's not intuitive. And in this situation, they had done this same kind of error. Now, granted, this is just the beta, and some of you may say, "Well, Daskro, you are just being tedious and looking at all these different details." But when we make the claim of authenticity, we have to try to get as close as we can to how it looks. And one of the easiest ways that developers can create authenticity is get some of the basics right. Can this given accessory or given gun actually do this? Does this gun have full auto fire versus only 3-round burst? Does this gun come in a certain configuration that allows it to do what we say it does? Other things of that nature. And Medal of Honor, at least in the beta, I was a bit skeptical of this. Hopefully they fix that issue. But even then, I hope that they're able to sort of create as much authenticity as they can when they talk about being able to accessorize your gun. Really know what the accessories are and not just make them just another feature where people don't realize that they may or may not be true to form in their real life counterparts.
Do you think that would be interesting as well to have more kind of realistic accessorization with weapons? Because let me just ask you, for someone who is not a weapons expert as such, and I know that you are, but let me just say, with specific weapons, is it true that in sort of real life with these guns themselves, there's only so much you could perhaps attach to them? There's certain weapons where certain things can't be attached. I mean, can you think of any examples off the top of your head from Battlefield where they have certain attachments or utilities which they couldn't use in reality?
Well, with a lot of the modern guns out there, you can put a lot on them, and there are a lot of mom and pop shops talking about little small machine shops that can make custom fittings to put basically anything on any of the guns out there. But when we talk about guns that are in their sort of stock configuration, the configuration that a military would purchase them from, there are some glaring disparities. The one that I've highlighted a few times is the SKS in Battlefield 3, where they've essentially taken a bunch of aftermarket products, which actually exist in real life, and make it into something in terms of it being sort of a recon class assault rifle, when in reality it's a 50-year-old plus a semi-automatic rifle that was only utilized for 5 to 6 years and then scrapped because it was too complicated. It was too much prone to jamming, and it was too complicated to manufacture.
And let me ask you, just really on that topic as well, talk about jamming. Now, Level Cap mentioned this vaguely at one time when I was talking to him. We were talking about the fact of realism and chance and all these kind of things. And I know Level has said before he hates the idea of chance in games because he feels like it takes away from the skill of a player, and there shouldn't be chance with equipment. There shouldn't be any random factors. It should be what this kit does in a game, and therefore you know what you can get out of it. I'm not so sure. I kind of like the idea of random elements coming into play. Things like jamming. Now, jamming obviously happens with weapons, and I assume that, again, some jam more than others, older weapons perhaps more than modern ones, and so on and so on. Do you think that that would be an interesting element? Because off the top of my head, I can't think of a game, an FPS game, which has had a jamming feature. I'm sure there probably was somewhere, because it's just by the laws of odds, there probably is one. So if anybody knows an FPS, please shout that one out. But what do you think about that, the idea of bringing that into a game? Do you think it's something that would be good? I mean, it obviously brings a realism element, but do you think that's kind of counterproductive?
Well, there have been games in the past that have tried to do this. The first one that comes to my mind is Far Cry 2, where Far Cry as a game was sort of an action FPS in the sense that or almost like an adventure FPS rather, where you'd pick up older guns, and those older guns had more wear in them, they had more rounds through them, and they'd be more prone to jam. And in fact, in the game, while you would be using them, some of them would jam, or some of them would alternatively explode in your face. And that was kind of a cool element to it. But let me give you an example about different kinds of
you could have dud grenades, for example, things like that. You know?
Oh yeah. I mean, in Battlefield 3, look at the Scar H or Scar L. In real life, it has a reciprocating charging handle. Now, for those that have not shot much guns in real life or know much about why reciprocating versus non-reciprocating, reciprocating versus non-reciprocating handles are important, a reciprocating charging handle means that if you're on the ground, if you're on the dirt, and you have some kind of obstruction next to that handle, and you fire the round, if something's in the way, it's not going to recycle to the next round. You're not going to be able to fire successive shots after that. Whereas non-reciprocating charging handles, such as, for instance, the G3A3 or the M5K, if something's in the way of that charging handle, it's not going to impact the operation of the gun. And so if you're using the Scar H or the Scar L in game, and you suddenly prone out and you're trying to shoot someone while you're next to a car underneath it, and you have your gun sort of parallel to that ground, and then something catches that charging handle, then the gun jams up, and then you're not good to go. Now, that's not a function of randomness. That's a function of how the gun is, and you're just simply placing the gun in a position where it's not going to be able to operate. Now, in this game, we don't have the ability to have this sort of custom feel of where we're exactly putting the gun relative to the rest of the environment, because of the limitations of the engine and the interface and everything around those lines. However, those kind of things are huge deals in real life. They really are, which is why some people choose certain guns over other guns because of reasons like those. Things like how the gun is reloaded. A lot of people in the U.S. military and otherwise don't like using the AKs, because the AKs have a much more I wouldn't say difficult, but it requires a bit more operation to reload the magazines relative to an AR-15 or M16 platform, where you have to ratchet in the magazine with an AK, whereas you slam in the magazine with an AR-15. And that kind of additional operation, which to a layman may not be more than a fraction of a second an increase in terms of doing said operation, that's a big deal to those individuals that are using these guns constantly and need to have as much high speed, low drag kind of things that they're trying to accomplish.
But these are the kind of things, you see, that I find particularly interesting, and I also think, why have these not been introduced into certain games? For one reason, probably that they're quite complicated to work out in terms of coding and the general dynamic and mechanic of them in the game. But when you have a title like Medal of Honor, which is really pushing itself to try and be more realistic, these all seem elements that they should try to bring into the game, but it rarely seems to happen. I actually really like the idea of weapons having more of these characteristics rather than statistical differences, because stats in weapons is something that I have never been a major fan of. I know some people really get into the stats and go, well, this has got 0.2 of a difference in damage and it reloads 0.3 milliseconds faster, and people love some of that crap because it gives them the ability to kind of go, well, my gun's better than yours, and just based on stats. It's one reason why I don't like it, because in game I always feel that the person using it, that has a much larger impact on the proficiency of the weapon than anything else. But stats are obviously quite a large thing in terms of, like we've said, the way they're exaggerated to give more characteristics to each weapon. But I actually prefer the idea that you would have more of these other mechanical characteristics, which would then dictate to you which weapon you want to choose in certain situations. I like that idea. I mean, do you think that would be preferable out of those two choices? Which do you think would be more interesting in the game?
Well, we have to take into consideration that there's one aspect of this we haven't really talked about nearly as much, which is there is a assumption here when we play these games that all of these guns are going to be balanced within a given range of abilities, be it in terms of one has better reload than the other, one has better accuracy than the other, so on and so forth. But the reality of it is, when you compare a lot of these guns, there are some guns in this game that in real life are distinctly inferior to other guns. The SKS is a 50-year-old gun that has absolutely no advantages compared to modern assault rifles chambered in intermediate calibers. Period. End of story. And there's probably some guys out there listening to it right now that have SKSs that think that they're great guns. They're fine guns, but there are better guns out there. It's no different than comparing cars. There are certain cars that were probably great at the time of when they came out, but compared to more modern cars, may not stand a chance to it. And if we go that route in terms of sort of extreme authenticity, where there are certain guns that are just easily better than others, then people are going to be like, wow, why should I even bother with other certain guns? That's sort of the dichotomy we have to worry about, is that we have all these guns, and people want to have a fun experience in playing the game. But if they know coming off the bat that wow, I'm going to go directly to XYZ gun because it's clearly better in terms of accuracy or ergonomics or things around those lines, then it's great. But the counter argument to this is that in real life, the differences in some of these guns, especially the more modern assault and battle rifles out there, they're so nuanced in nature that the differences are really not going to be perceived within the given game, because the fact that you don't reload the rifle in game with any kind of arduous requirements. You push the R button, or you push the button for the on PS3 or Xbox. You just push one button. That's all you do. In real life, it's a series of muscle movements that are usually put into muscle memory, and it's executed based on the amount of experience you have and the amount of training you have. In this game, it's just to push the button. And so when we start thinking about it in those terms, and the fact that there are so many things that we are letting the game do instead of the person do, we have to sort of differentiate in other ways. Because if you have a top tier operator doing one thing, why is it so unreasonable to think that if they're proficient in AR-15, they can't be proficient in a Steyr AUG or a KS2002 or whatever it may be?
I've got two more little points to put to you. One is that I think people have spoken about this before, and I saved the question for you because I think it suits you much better. People have asked before about ammunition, basically, and having different ammunition in game, things like hollow point and extra armor piercing and stuff like that. Do you think that would be an interesting feature to bring into games like Battlefield? It seems to me that it would kind of suit quite well, but do you think it would be, again, maybe an overcomplication to bring into the game itself, or do you think that it would add another dimension and give people more choices when they're choosing their loadout for their character and their playstyle?
Well, we have to be careful when we start moving closer to this greater realism or this greater authenticity, because as an example, in this game, when you fire into the sky, you have all these tracer rounds. In real life, you don't use tracer rounds that often. You use tracer rounds in certain types of medium caliber and heavy machine guns, and that's about it, period. And with the exception of maybe looking at hollow point versus armor piercing rounds, which really are the two predominant rounds within a intermediate and large caliber battle rifles.
I mean, let me just hop in here and say, for example, I mean, with the shotguns, they have made a very clear point of specifying different rounds for all the shotguns, but then they don't go further to that to carry over the two, as we say, the most predominant basic rounds for the other rifles. Seems an interesting choice that they haven't done that with those two things,
No, I sort of go back to the old Rainbow Six series where you had the choice of full metal jacket versus armor piercing, and it had some advantages over the other, but take in consideration that even with the shotgun rounds, they got it wrong. The bullets, the spread of a 12 gauge buckshot is not that much different than that of a slug round. It really isn't. You're just talking about spread pattern, and that spread pattern doesn't spread out in a linear fashion. It actually keeps very close spreads depending on the choke that you're putting on the gun. For quite some distance. Now, the effective ranges are certainly going to be different. They do get that right, but they still utilize an exaggeration to sort of differentiate between them.
I mean, there's other rounds as well for shotgun, which I find actually more interesting than some of the ones that they chose. I mean, there's obviously the Dragon Breath one, which is quite spectacular. But there's another, but there's the other round as well. I think is it called? Is it Bullard, but it's the two ball bearings with a piece of wire between?
Yes, it's very medieval in nature.
Yeah,
to say the least.
but again, that seems quite an interesting piece of kit to be using as well, and it's interesting that they didn't include that. It seems it seems one that would definitely have its own characteristic in game, and that they could have included.
When you look at the ballistic gelatin results for a lot of these rounds, they are not that much different. They still do a lot of damage, and the big differences are effective range, but that more generally goes into the issue of bullet damage. As it relates to real life. In real life, most bullets do a lot of damage when they hit you once, period. And for a lot of, when you look at a lot of the statistics of casualties out there, be it in terms of domestic gun violence versus that in conflict, people are dying from only 1 or 2 gunshots. And I think a lot of people would certainly get frustrated very quickly if they got one-shotted and then they go down and then they're down and then or worse yet, I think of the Onion video. For those that haven't seen this, it's a video that the Onion newspaper did where the new Call of Duty game was you playing
Yes.
in Iraq where you're waiting for 6 months and then you randomly get shot in the face. And
I saw
that's
that.
the game.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's sort of the extreme of realism that we're talking about.
Yeah,
when you start talking about looking at how the bullets actually impact the human body in real life, it's not pretty. It's not something that you can take a hit and you get over. Now, granted, you could say the counter argument: hey, these people are high tier operators who can take a hit. And so on and so forth, and that's fine. I mean, take consideration that we look at a lot of popular movies out there. I mean, I think of the recent movie that the U.S. Navy put out. What was that movie? It was the I'm blanking here. There's a certain category of individuals who within the U.S. military that are the highest of abilities that can take a few shots, and in this game we are playing those characters, and so sure, we can take a few shots and still be able to react and go from there. The movie was Act of Valor, is that right?
Act of Valor, yeah, that's right, yeah,
yes.
Yeah. But bring us back to that point as well, though. But we didn't really resolve. Do you think that Hollow Point and Armor Piercing, for example, do you think they would have a role to play? Do you think they'd make the game more interesting?
I think that if we had body armor in the game similar to Counter-Strike, then it would make it more interesting, because
I like the idea of bringing that in. I mean, that's another thing. I think for some reason people have this real bias. They don't like things like... I tell you where it comes from. I think it comes from like for Call of Duty with Juggernaut. People have that in their head now that they hate this idea. I mean, basically that's what you would be talking about putting into the game, I suppose, in many ways, would be the old Call of Duty 4 Juggernaut and stopping power, because that's basically what you would be putting into the game. Is some people have, you know, the extra armor, some people have the ability to negate it. That's pretty much what you'd be putting in. But I think if you were going to do it, perhaps, I don't know, it's a tricky one, isn't it?
Well, it's almost like, I mean, think of when you're in that UH-1 Venom in Battlefield 3. Well, look at your character. Your character itself has a ballistic helmet on.
Yeah.
And is firing that Gatling gun.
Yeah.
And
actually, let me talk about that as well. Just you can tack this onto your point after you finish.
Okay.
But the guns on that, do you find that those guns are as effective as they would be perhaps in real life? Because often you can fire a hell of a lot of rounds out of that and hit your target, and it still sort of seems to survive quite well. Are they powerful enough to be representative?
I mean, again, depending on the ammunition that they're using, it's incredibly variable. And I mean, they make depleted uranium ammunition for that caliber of a gun that they're shooting at, that, which means that it would be incredibly effective against certain types of armored vehicles. And unlike in the game, if you as a person get shot by anything, regardless of whether it's a full metal jacket or hollow point or depleted uranium round, you're going to be in for a world of hurt. And when you look at the rate of fire of some of those Gatling guns and the chain guns, it is mind-boggling. And so it's not a question of you getting hit once; it's you getting hit a half dozen times. And so I'm a bit discouraged that the amount of damage it does is so little.
Sometimes with those rounds, I mean, that's what I mean. I think it's, you know, we obviously couldn't have a situation where, like you say, one round and you're down. I think that would be, you know, we have to remember that they're trying to balance it to make it an enjoyable game. But when you have a weapon like a Gatling gun, which it's horrific, but I think in reality they would cut a person in half. And I think it's crazy that when you're flying around in that helicopter in Battlefield, you can fire at a load of guys on the ground, you get a ton of hit markers, and it does nothing to them. Yeah, go on.
I've I've shot a Gatling gun a few times in real life. One of those, the same kind of gun that you see in Battlefield 3 on a Blackhawk. I've shot at at a few events, and I'll tell you the amount of ammo you go through is incredibly fast, and that's one of the other aspects of the game that you don't see. Now, let's say for instance that it was a one-shot kill, or was if you just almost like a laser, where you just sort of move over a given target, it just kills them instantly. That'd be fine and all, but then there's another consideration where you're going to run out of ammo after 2 or 3 seconds, and you're going to have to manually reload that chain gun. And I mean, how much would a person enjoy playing Battlefield 3 have if they have to spend 30 seconds at minimum, taking that machine gun belt, getting another ammo can, putting it into its little canister, and then do other things around those lines.
Well, consider this: when you have like a light machine gun or something within Battlefield, they take quite a while to reload. You have to unlock it, click, put the whole thing back in, put the rounds feed back in, lock it back down again. So it takes quite a while. I actually personally, just talking about that specific instance, I like the idea of the Venom miniguns being extremely powerful, but like you say, you get maybe 4 or 5 seconds of fire and then it's gone, and then they have to spend more time reloading. I'll tell you why, because how many games have you been in where people actually get kills with that thing? It's extremely difficult.
Yeah, it's a bit disappointing.
Yeah, and I have to say, I think I prefer that idea of the fact that when as long as you've got it in your sights and you unload that weapon, they're going down. It's almost like guaranteed. But then you can't just continually use it. You have to lock it. Think of, for example, as a balancing thing, the attack helicopter. Okay, the chain gun on the attack helicopter in Battlefield is extremely powerful. As soon as you have a target on the ground and you fire roughly at that target, it's going down. The Venom, on the other hand, it seems to be completely imbalanced in terms of its firepower for those weapons.
Yes, and one other aspect to that is that when we think of maybe the M60, the M240, the M249, the support class, I like how they do have to go through this big amount of effort to reload the rifle. But another aspect to it is barrel changing. In real life, if you put several hundred rounds through a barrel within a very short period of time, that barrel is going to eventually melt, or at least get to a point where it is so unstable that your accuracy degrades so much that you have to change it out. If you look at back in Battlefield Bad Company 2, you had the MG3, which in of itself was a derivative of the MG42 that the Germans used in World War II. Yeah. One of the really cool things about that gun is it has a quick change barrel capability, which means you can put on a set of gloves and you can essentially do about 2 or 3 operations and eject the barrel the gun's using and put in a new barrel and then be in that fight again. That aspect of it is something we don't see in any games. It wasn't in Far Cry 2. It wasn't in the other games out there. But quick changing a barrel doesn't take that long. It only takes about a minute to a minute and 30 seconds. I've seen quick change barrels take place on machine gun shoots that I've attended in the past.
I mean, this is an interesting thing to bring in, and I say we need to sort of tie this one up. But just to maybe finish on thinking about this, it would be an interesting thing where you have weapons that are perhaps more effective but have more of these other issues. So people can't just run around the map opening fire at whatever they see. People have to really pick and choose their engagements. I mean, do you think that could create a realistic working game? When I say realistic, I mean a game which people could realistically play and still enjoy. I think if a developer took the time to think about the logistics of it, think about the dynamics of it, and work out how people would actually play that game out, I think you could build something which was more realistic but still kept the elements which would make it enjoyable for people to play. Do you think that would be possible as well?
I think it can be if you let the players know ahead of time what the restraints are. I had made a gun comparison video where I took an AK-74M in game and compared it to a full auto AK in real life. And one of the things that I edited out of the video was you could hear the owner of this full auto AK complaining to me. And what he says is, here's what he says. He says, "Hey Daskro, you've put 4 mags through it within a minute and a half. You need to slow down, or you're gonna melt the barrel." And and I took that out because I didn't want to be embarrassed. But the reason why I bring this up is because if you as a player put 4 mags through an AK-74, it actually would deteriorate the barrel to the point where it may create reliability issues or create certainly accuracy issues. And if players knew that they can't just spray and pray, and certainly right now with suppression, the way it's enabled, it encourages just throwing massive amounts of lead at the enemy to get that suppression on them. If you had a disincentive to do that because the gun may jam more or may be less accurate, I would be in favor of that. I think
that's quite
really
interesting.
Cool.
Is there any counter to that other than, for example, slowing down your fire rate or changing out the barrel? Is there any kind of technical, you could use different compounds or anything?
You could throw it in a pond of water, I guess. I mean, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Or alternatively, there are certain barrels that can take much higher.
Yeah.
Alternatively,
that's what I was thinking of. And you see, that's why I was saying this is another element that people could, again, change out. If they're picking a class or their play style where they know they're going to be firing a lot, if, for example, their role is suppression, then maybe, they would choose to take a different style of barrel or something like that. I think, again, all of these things are kind of interesting. Okay, so I want to thank Daskro for joining me on this video today.
Great, yeah, I had a lot of fun, Luetin, and we'll do this again sometime.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts and what you think about the topics that we've discussed today, guys. If you have any sort of personal opinions about whether games should be more realistic, do you think it's a workable thing? Do you think it doesn't matter and games should just be able to do whatever the hell they want to make the gameplay viable? I think people will say that, definitely. But, does this kind of more tactical element appeal to you? Do you think that these guns should be balanced perhaps a little bit more realistically and people could be more specific in their role in game? Love to hear the thoughts and feedback, guys. Thanks for watching this one. Please, as always, like, share, subscribe if you enjoyed it. I'll see you for some more Battlefield very soon.